Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to all our viewers that are joining us for the first in our new series, which is called Speaker's Corner. Tonight, we kick off with an outstanding guest speaker and leader. I'm joined tonight by Rabbi Major Reuben Livingstone, who is the most senior Jewish chaplain to the armed forces and to Ajax. And he is going to give us a whistle-stop tour of his work and the involvement and contribution that the Jewish people have made, that in this country, Anglo-Jewry has made to the armed forces. There will be an opportunity both during and at the end for people to ask questions, but without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to invite Rabbi Livingstone to join us. Good evening, Rabbi Livingstone. Can you hear me? Rabbi Livingstone, good evening.
Good evening, Rabbi Hackenbroch, and thank you for that very august introduction. Very grateful to you.
No, it is an absolute pleasure. This has been eagerly anticipated by our viewers, and we are very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts, your insights, and sharing with us so much of your wealth of knowledge about the armed forces. So without further ado, I am going to disappear and I'm going to allow you to share your thoughts. And then afterwards, I look forward to joining you for the Q&A. We'll look forward to joining you afterwards. I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Livingstone.
Thank you. Right. So it's a delight to be here with you today and to share not only some of my contemporary experience in the British Armed Forces, but in fact, give you, in Rabbi Hackenbroch's words, a whistle-stop tour of Jewish military service throughout the ages from the Torah onwards. So I'm going to start there, and I will lead into a more current conversation about what we do and our experience in the British Army, Navy, and Air Force. Anti-Semites throughout the ages have always rather maliciously accused Jews of seeking to evade military duty. And this lie has been disproved again and again over time. And yet many Jews have unwittingly actually absorbed it, or at least the part that implies that Jews are not particularly well suited to this type of pursuit and should stick with being doctors and lawyers and the rest. A few years ago, I attended a fascinating lecture at King's College by Professor Derek Penslar, who was the Stanley Lewis Professor of Israel Studies and Fellow at St. Anne's College, Oxford, and the University of Toronto. And his topic was Dreyfus was not alone. The army as a Jewish career in modern Europe. And he made the point that the Dreyfus affair, which saw the victimization of a French artillery officer, was actually not at all typical of the Jewish experience in European armies. And based on archival research, he showed that in France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and several other countries during the Victorian era, between 4 and 18% of military officers were actually Jewish, hugely more than the proportion of Jews in the wider populations. In Russia, under very different conditions, the same situation prevailed, with even greater numbers in the Soviet Red Army and in the Tsar's army prior to that. And this was partly, according to Penslar, because a military career offered Jews greater equality of opportunity, especially in technical areas such as engineering, artillery, and logistics, where they often excelled. It also gave them the means to shine as men and put to rights the noxious stereotype of the passive or pacifistic Jew. The famous Rabbi Yisroel Meir Kagan of Radin, known as the Chofetz Chaim, actually in the late 19th century wrote a guidebook for Jewish soldiers called Machane Yisroel. And it's highly significant that despite offering special leniencies for serving personnel and encouraging them towards Judaism, nowhere in the work does he actually say that Jews should not serve or that such was prohibited. On the contrary, the author really is reaching out to these men. They're often a forgotten subcommunity then as now within a wider Jewish community that doesn't really know what they get up to. So without too much further ado, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour from the Torah onward, and to cite the fact that clearly our patriarchs, Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophets that followed, the Hasmoneans, and so on and so forth, clearly they had a military dimension. And it was often very, very central, not only to their lives, but to the lives of their co-religionists. Abraham, upon hearing that his kinsman Lot has become mixed up in an internecine war between 5 kings and 4 kings, Vayorik as Chanichov, he girds his loins, raises a militia, and he enters the fray militarily with force, and prevails, and is able to free Lot and many others, and is rewarded by the Melech Stone for his gallantry. You have later in the Torah the episode of Yaakov and Esau, where Yaakov prepares for military conflict, in that instance with his own brother, but nevertheless he's preparing for a battle. And you have Moshe as a military leader, and the Jewish camp in the book of Numbers, in Sefer Bamidbar, actually being described as a military quadrilateral, with ensigns flying and with very military overtones in terms of the placement of the various Jewish tribes. You have the war of Midian in the Torah, in Bamidbar. You have elements of the conquest of the land in the book of Joshua, and subsequently in the books of Shmuel and Malachim, Samuel and Kings, all addressing the conquest in military terms. And although it's true to say that rabbinic Judaism is more pacifistic, biblical Judaism has a very strong military connection to it. So the idea that Jews were not fighters is just roundly disproved by the Torah itself. The Hasmonean revolt against the Seleucid Greeks was much revered in its time. This is about 123 BCE, and the Hashmonaim were lionized. The Chag of Hanukkah, which we'll shortly celebrate, flows from that. But the Hasmoneans didn't fulfill the high aspirations of the rabbis or of the Jewish people in terms of Judaism, and therefore there was a moving away from the military element towards the more spiritual element, which is symbolized by the miracle of the oil. We also find that the rabbis were painfully aware, the rabbis of the Talmud were painfully aware of the Roman conquest and destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and of Jerusalem itself. And as a result of that, and Jews had a fighting role, and some of the fighting role was directed towards fellow Jews. And there were battles that raged within Jerusalem between various factions. And that proved something of a bitter pill to swallow. And we become over time, because of these events, somewhat more pacifistic than our roots might have foretold. What's really interesting when one looks to the destruction of Jerusalem as an example is that the Emperor Justinian actually sent a Jewish general to subdue Jerusalem. one Julius Tiberius Alexander, who was an Alexandrian Jew. And the Talmud and other sources see Titus, the son of Justinian, as the military leader. But in fact, it was left to a professional soldier in the hope that he would negotiate with the Jews and that a war wouldn't be necessary. So quite a clever move to send a Jew. But it was interesting that there was a Jewish general available to him. And the fact is that much as Professor Penzlar describes of the Victorian era, membership of the Roman army, either the border patrol, the Limitani, or the legions themselves, was a fast track for Jews towards Roman citizenship. And this is mentioned in historical works, but it's also mentioned by allusion in the Talmud itself. And therefore Jews did serve, and there were a pool of Jews, both officers and soldiers, to draw upon. I want to segue through history to focus in the next few minutes onto the British Armed Forces. And it's well known that there were Jewish Royal Navy admirals in as early as the 18th century. So Alexander Schomburg and his son Sir Wilmot Schomburg, and later a Sephardi admiral, Sir Max Horton. Didn't sound very Jewish, but he was certainly Jewish. And they participated in the Battle of Trafalgar, at Cadiz, and were very, very important in the history of the Royal Navy. And if you can have an admiral who's Jewish and openly Jewish, there must have been others, and in fact there were apparently others, numbering about 143 in the Royal Navy of that era. So one wouldn't think that Jews would sign up for that type of life. One might understand the officer class doing so, but in fact there were many others. At the Battle of Waterloo, there were Jewish field surgeons as well as Jewish soldiers. They served equally in Crimea. In the Boer War, according to British Army records, there were no less than 3,000 Jews who served. I find that a remarkable figure, but that is the recorded number, give or take. In World War I, there were 50,000 or so Jews from a community that numbered no more than about 400,000, and that's being generous. So that's more than 1 in 10. There were in fact 27 chaplains, Jewish chaplains, rabbis, who served both on the mainland and in Europe. We have generals like General Monash of the Royal Australian Forces, and who Montgomery described as the finest general of the World War I generation, and so on and so forth. What's interesting when one speaks of numbers, and everyone always asks me how many Jews are there serving and how many Jews were there serving at a particular time. What's really important to recognize is that it has never been obligatory to declare one's faith. We encourage it. It's important if in the case of a soldier or sailor airman getting killed, they won't have Jewish burial rights unless they're recorded as Jewish. But that hasn't stopped many generations of Jews being reticent to declare their Jewish faith at the front end of their military service. And therefore, I think that the 50,000 that we record in World War I is probably an approximate number, because there must have been, there will have been many who didn't indicate they were Jewish. They were frightened of anti-Semitism. They were frightened of being singled out. The expression in the army today is that soldiers of all denominations and persuasions seek to go gray. They seek to be anonymous. Otherwise, they'll be singled out for banter or for or criticism, all for being different, and that's not something in a military sort of formation where uniformity is prized. It's not something that Jews tended to be comfortable with. We often count the numbers who served, for instance, in World War I, but not realizing that throughout the Commonwealth there were also many Jews, and so there were Jews in the Royal Canadian Forces, in the Royal Australian Forces, in the New Zealand Forces, and so on. And certainly on the American side, there were vast numbers that eclipsed our numbers. So there were actually, in World War I, as in World War II, almost 1 million Jews who fought, and that's no small number, and that's from many countries on both sides of the conflict. In World War II, 60 to 70,000 UK Jews served, and again the same commentary applies in terms of the Commonwealth of Nations and in terms of other nations. And again, there were over 1 million Jews who participated in that terrible conflict. On the American side, there were over 400,000. So their numbers grew significantly in the Second World War. And in Britain, national service continued after the Second World War and only finishes in 1960, 1961. And that's when the numbers of Jews tapered off. But until then, everyone had to do, unless you were exempted, everyone had to do national service. So those of a particular age and vintage, and they're getting on a bit now, and many still around in Ajax, they will have served in national service. And it didn't mean that they were on peacetime deployments. There were actually conflicts going on during national service. Korea happened at that time. There were certainly other conflicts that Britain participated in. So it was a fairly kinetic period, as we say. The numbers since the end of national service are admittedly small, but they have remarkably continued to exist as a subcommunity. And in the modern era, we have seen a certain revival of affiliation to our military community. We have about 200 in our virtual Kehillah, and the precise numbers are unknown to me now. We used to be able to count them, but data protection has intervened, and I myself can't know unless someone has given express permission whether they're Jewish. But when you add in the secret intelligence services alongside the 3 armed services, and those are MI5, MI6, GCHQ, and you add in the Ministry of Defense itself, which is a fairly hefty ministry, in and amongst all of that, and that's all my community, as it were. I'm the rabbi to that piece. You might have upwards of 1,000 Jews in various guises. These days, we produce kosher food, kosher ration packs. We've written and we've amended the rules, and whereby for religious Jews, beards are permitted. There are concessions to Shabbat and Jewish observance, which frankly never existed before in wartime. And we are very proud of having pioneered in the modern era. I should say also that there is an important Israel dimension in the British Armed Forces. I have found that there's very little anti-Israel sentiment, if any, in amongst those who serve in the military. They sort of understand and get what Israel is facing. And many of Israel's enemies and the tactics that they are constantly facing are well understood by the British Armed Services. And so all in all, I've been struck by the pro-Israel sentiment very different than wider society. But this is not just about understanding Israel's plight. It's also about understanding how Israel is vital to British defense. It's vital in terms of intelligence. Israel has the premier ability to pass what they call communications interception. And you can listen, as we do on Cyprus, you can listen to the entire Middle East, but that doesn't mean that you have both the IT algorithms or the linguistics to understand everything that's being said. But the Israelis have an unrivaled ability in this area. In fact, when I deployed at RAF Akrotiri during the war against ISIS recently, I was struck by the numbers of Israeli personnel who would come and go out of our own listening post, and clearly they were helping us rather than vice versa. It's said that 70% of the UK terror plots that were intercepted and foiled were done so following tip-offs from Israel, no less, because the chatter will emerge somewhere in the Middle East. Israel will pick it up, and Israel will tip off the UK as well as the rest of the West that this is going on. And it's a vital element, it's a vital pillar in British national security. Again, not widely known, but occasionally makes the press. The other dimension in terms of Israel, and of course, I'm not talking about military service in Israel. I'm just talking about the British Armed Forces and our relationship in regard for Israel, which I just think is interesting. We are very dependent on Israel's technology. And we all know about the Iron Dome. We all know about similar, more sort of offensive technologies like the Chet system, the David Sling system. These are various sort of ballistic and anti-ballistic systems which have been pioneered by Israel in conjunction with the United States. In fact, we rely on these technologies. Britain's Type 45 destroyers, which are seaborne anti-ballistic platforms, depend critically on some of this very technology. The British soldier personal protection system, just as a wild example, which is everything that kits out a soldier, from body armor to helmet to uniform, hydration, and night vision. All of that is really designed. So that's very, very important to us. And the list goes on and on and on. So Israel is a very important element of in technologically of the British experience. Beyond that, I think it's important to say that the armed forces are a very good place to be as a Jew. There are many Jewish professionals who've acquired their professions while serving in the army, and whether they are doctors or dentists or even accountants and lawyers, because the terms and conditions are not onerous, and it's a very, very vital and interesting route to qualification, being sponsored by one of our armed services. And as a result, quite a few Jewish doctors, some of them reservists, some of them regulars, have come that route, and they don't work for the National Health Service, but they might be deployed into the National Health Service. That certainly was the case during the COVID era. One of the heads of our armed forces Jewish community, the lay heads, is an emergency medicine consultant, and who was deployed into the National Health Service during the recent pandemic. So that's a really interesting dimension. Increasingly, military service is technical and professional, and Jews are welcome within that. And as I say, very little anti-Semitism, if any. Some of the old-fashioned anti-Semitism, I call it the old-fashioned anti-Semitism, emanates from those who are just ignorant of Jews and Judaism. It's just about a lack of communication. Some of that might exist in pockets, but the new anti-Semitism, which is really anti-Zionism, masquerading as something other than anti-Semitism, that really doesn't exist for the reasons that I've already explained. So, in summary, and by way of just bringing this to a shorter version, I just want to recap that that Jewish service goes back to antiquity, and it travels through the Torah, through the times of Chazal, and the subsequent eras, with Jews serving in ancient Rome, no less, and in fact throughout history. Perhaps not so much in the Middle Ages, but as Derek Penslar explains, there is a notable resurgence of Jewish service from the 1800s onward, and certainly in the great conflicts of the 20th century, Jews have served front center, and they have contributed well in disproportion to the size of their communities. We don't tend to be loud and proud as serving Jews. We tend to be quite low key about it. But even in the current era, there are several hundreds, with Israel also playing a vital security dimension, not only in our service in Britain, but in terms of supporting the wider defense position in Britain. And I think we can be very, very proud of that indeed. Just as a final point, I should say that that Jewish chaplaincy has existed in this country since 1896. There were many Jews, as many as 27 in the First World War, 30 odd during the Second World War, some deployed in the front line, on the front line, and others on the homeland front. And that continues. The fact that I'm able to act as the rabbi of a military community, give advice to the Ministry of Defense, and that our membership is taken not only from the armed services, but as I said, from the secret intelligence services, is really something that we should be very proud of. I think that not every Jew would want or require to serve in the British Armed Forces. They might be tempted to enlist in Tzahal, to volunteer for Tzahal before that. But nevertheless, those that serve in this country and wear the Queen's uniform in this country do a great service, unsung and unacknowledged, for our wider community, because they are flying the flag of Jewish service. They are making it known to those in the defense universe, as well as those in government and indeed in the royal family, that Jews do serve in these capacities. And I always feel that that is a hedge against anti-Semitism. We are putting to rights the noxious stereotype of the Jew that doesn't serve, that is self-serving, and we are trailblazing in that regard and doing something for the wider community. With that, I'll close. I'll invite you through the chat to share any questions that you might have now.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Livingstone. Whilst we're waiting for some of the questions to come on the chat, and friends, I'd I'd encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to have a phenomenal speaker with a wealth of wisdom about the armed forces and about Jewish involvement around the world. Please post your questions now. I'd just like you to share, Rabbi Livingstone, a bit about how do services work? I mean, you know, do you just set up a service, or is there like a moving tabernacle? How does it work with the High Holy Days? Perhaps you can give us some insight into military services in the service.
Well, that's a really interesting question. We do have several Shabbatonim across the year. The mainstay of the highlight of that is actually in early January, where we have the several days of what we call the Jewish conference. We gather from time to time on Shabbosos throughout the year. We haven't managed to have actual services over Yom Noraim, but what I try to do is give people a flavor before the actual Chagim, before Yom Tov, before Shabbos, give them a flavor of the davening, give them a flavor of the spiritual themes, and that's very sustaining. Remember, a military community is by definition very dispersed. We have, we have a couple people here, a couple people there, literally across the globe. So the paradox of the pandemic was that the Zoom paradigm came in very, very handy for us, and we have seen an uptick in virtual events and virtual shiurim. What we've also done is that we have a deal going with the United Synagogue, with the Federation of Synagogues, with the Spanish and Portuguese, and with other non-Orthodox denominations to welcome Jewish serving personnel into their shuls and to help them and to facilitate them over Yom Noraim in particular, but in general with Shabbos hosting and with a little bit of TLC. So that's the type of thing that I do. But my job is to give a sense of a virtual community to individuals who are dispersed across the world, and I do that through I give a Dvar Torah every Erev Shabbos, for instance. So something goes out, and that becomes a discussion. It's interactive, and with that, people have a sense of being embraced and a sense of learning and a sense of davening too. It may not be strictly halachic in terms of davening over Zoom, and there are issues there which I won't go into now. But my job is to embrace people and give them a flavor, and I think we do that quite successfully.
Right. Okay. Very nice. Is there a chazan, to the armed forces, an official chazan?
No, we don't have a chazan. I'm the chief cook and bottle washer in that regard. I should say that there is a really interesting phenomenon whereby, and we've pioneered a lot of this, that on every military base or station, there is a prayer room. They call it a World Faith Prayer Room, so it's a non-denominational type of room. But in those rooms across the entire piece, we have chumashim, sidurim, talesim, tefillin, Jewish accoutrements that allow anyone to go in there and actually daven morning, noon, and night, Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, and so that is across the piece, and in fact, even internationally, in places as diverse as Oman and the Middle East, and indeed the Africa and the Far East. So there might not be shuls as such, and but there's certainly access to all sorts of Jewish accoutrements and tashmishe mitzvah. What's really interesting is that this is probably the only instance where the government pays for tefillin and mezuzahs and Sifrei Kodesh.
Well, that's fascinating. Can you share with us perhaps the most high-ranking officer, the Jewish, in the past, historically? Is there somebody that we know that was a very high-ranking officer as a Jew?
Yeah, we have currently no major generals. We've got about 3 brigadier generals, including Simon Goldstein, very Jewish name, who's more on the administrative personnel side of the army. We recently had the chief of defense personnel. He's a 3-star general, a lieutenant general, and he is Jewish, but now retired from the service. But we've got numbers of lieutenant colonels, and as I said, brigadiers, and so we have people in reasonably high-ranking positions. In the Royal Navy, we have a vice admiral, we have a vice commodore in the RAF who's Jewish. But it's not about rank, you know. So often in today's armed forces, the policy can be impacted by the ground up, and the ordinary soldier, the non-commissioned officer, can have a real impact. Certainly since Afghanistan, that is the case. It's not all about rank, and some of those Jews who you'd be most surprised to discover are not the officer class. Who, I mean, that's a no-brainer. That's sort of a career path for Jews, but it's the guys who actually do the fighting, and there are quite a few Jews who've done that. We had Jewish casualties in Afghanistan, unfortunately. We had a Jewish casualty in the Falklands who was a member of the Paras, and on Goose Green, and so Jews are, you know, of every rank and stripe, and they paid the price.
Right. In terms of Remembrance Sunday, Ajax usually has one. Obviously, we're now, you know, we're heading out of COVID. Can you tell us what the plans are for this year?
So Ajax, which is really the veterans group of Jews, people who have served, but also supported by the Armed Forces Jewish community, the AFJC, who are the serving element. They club together these days. We have our Remembrance Parade. It's been running since the 1920s, continuously, and it ran through lockdown as well. Smaller numbers, and we did it virtually, but we still were at the cenotaph. But we have an event 1 week after Remembrance Sunday. So that's going to be the 21st of November this year, and everyone is invited to come
right.
out.
So basically, it's business as usual. People can come along, and the marching, and it'll be the same as usual.
Absolutely, it's business as usual, and in fact, the armed services, it's been business as usual throughout the pandemic.
Okay, I think that's a message we need to get out there, because obviously, you know, with the COVID pandemic mindset, not everyone is necessarily aware that it is that everything is going, you know, everything will be in full motion. Okay. I wanted you to share, because obviously I didn't know this, but you shared with me when we met recently about my uncle and what he introduced into the armed forces. I have an uncle, friends, called, he passed away a number of years ago, whose name was the Very Reverend Alec Major Ginsburg. And Rabbi Livingstone shared with me fascinating insight that I don't even know if his family knew, but I certainly didn't know, about what he introduced when he served in the forces.
So Alec Ginsburg actually joined as a regular chaplain, I believe, in 1946. So literally just out of the war. I'm not sure he served during the war, but he was the longest serving Jewish chaplain. His duty went from 1946 until the early 1960s. So that's 20 years. Not a job for a rabbi, but he did it with great vigor. And he was the senior Jewish chaplain to the Middle East, stationed at one point in Egypt. And during the period in Egypt, he actually funded and built out of a mobile ambulance. He created a shul on the back of the ambulance, and that was a one-off. You mentioned davening. He was able to take his shul wherever he went.
Incredible.
And there are archival pictures that I've seen in the Royal Army Chaplains Museum. And he was also a very determined character, which one has to be as in the armed forces.
Yeah.
And you'd be very proud of him. He flew the flag of Yiddishkeit very, very well. He's still remembered unto this very day. I know he's got a couple of sons who are still around, but his main achievement were these innovations. And the mobile ambulance, which served as a shul and had Sifrei Torah, is unprecedented in any armed force, as far as I'm aware. And he created that.
Fascinating. So Louise Mason has put on, good evening, Louise, that my uncle's family, Lazarus, brackets Langdon, all served in the armed forces, and her uncle served in the Korean War. And on her mother's side, one was a major who only recently retired.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Have you ever come across family that have been on opposing sides at the same time?
That happened during World War I.
Yes.
And it famously happened in the trenches.
Yes.
Sometimes, some of the trenches would take direct mortar hits, and Jews on one side would hear Shema Yisrael emanating from the other side.
Yeah.
Really tragic, and there were Jewish chaplains in the German army, and quite a lot of Judaism as well. They weren't well funded, unlike us. They had to fundraise for every sefer and every siddur and every machzor that they gave out. But that was certainly the case. In other conflicts, much less so. In fact, I don't know that it ever happened in recent conflicts. Jews were involved in the Korean War. I've spoken to a number of Korean War veterans. People don't know that was a terrible, very dirty, horrible conflict. And the Brits were involved, and quite a number of Jews were involved. But again, disappearing in the sands of history.
Right. And what about for somebody who's have you ever seen Jewish serving army personnel where you've seen through the army a transformation? In other words, they've become more spiritual, more connected as a result of the experiences that they've had. Does that happen?
Really interesting question. My own experience is that serving personnel often are much more focused on issues of mortality and life and death. They're a serious cohort in terms of their thinking. They're also interested in Hashem and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're interested in Judaism in a way that is very unusual for a youth population. So for me, I find them exceptionally interested and receptive. The davening services that we've had have actually been remarkably sincere and very, very moving. It's worthy of note that we give out Sidurim, and I often find that on deployment, our personnel will always carry their Sidurim. They might not be religious. They tend to request kosher food on deployment, because they feel that will somehow vouchsafe them and help them. And it's a lovely thought in reality. Lieutenant Paul Mervis, who was one of the young officers, I believe related to Chief Rabbi Mervis, who was killed in 2009 in Afghanistan. When he was killed in a firefight, his siddur was in his top breast pocket, and he was beginning to find his way back to Judaism, paradoxically, before Hashem took him. So I find it actually a very receptive milieu. These world faith prayer rooms that I've described, they are used, and the tefillin, we're often denuded of mezuzot and of telesim because people want them and they want to use them. So I find a very thirsty population, and more
Mm.
so than in Civvy Street, and particularly so when people have deployed to conflict and have had that type of life-changing experience.
One final question for me, and that is, obviously you've spoken about the extraordinary work that you and your colleagues perform helping, facilitating Jews in the armed forces to serve as Jews. What about in terms of your role with the non-Jewish serving soldiers? Because obviously everyone's made in the image of God, and everyone, may be searching for God. How do you, what interactions do you have with the wider army personnel?
So I've actually got two strings to my bow,
Okay,
because as a regimental chaplain, having looked after a regiment of logistics, of Royal Army Logistics Corps soldiers, I deal with Jews and non-Jews alike,
right.
and I'm sort of an ambassador in that regard. In terms of my main role as Jewish chaplain, uh, one of the things that I do is advise the Ministry of Defense and make sure that our policies within the armed forces are Jewish friendly. And I interface with non-Jewish personnel all of the time. It's really important that I impress them as to Jewish morality and the fact that we've got a strong view. We might be a tiny population, but we have much to share in terms of ethics and much to teach. Um, I don't. I'm not hung up on the fact that I'm Jewish. I will often feel that I'm speaking to someone with a bit of Jewish blood in them. You know that strange, uh, rather amorphous feeling, but you know the person is either Jewish or whatever. And when I come onto a base, etc., I'll often detect who's Jewish by the direction in which they're running. Are they running towards me or away from me?
Hmm,
But so with that said, it's all for one and one for all. I don't
that's
discriminate, but my
fantastic.
main role is to support Jews and Judaism.
That's fantastic. Rabbi Major Reuven Livingstone, I want to thank you on behalf of the whole community for your absolutely spellbinding presentation this evening to our community and beyond. And of course, this presentation will be up on the YouTube channel and no doubt on the US TV channel as well for everyone to tap into. It's been absolutely a pleasure to have you on board, and we look forward to
Thank you.
welcoming you, please God, to our community in person in the not too distant future. Rabbi Livingstone, thank you so,
Thank
so
you.
much for joining us.
Thank you so much, and keep up the good work.
We will try our best. Take care. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. We'll be back same time, same place next week for another encounter on Speaker's Corner. Until next week, take care, keep safe, keep well, all the very best.